Okay, so let's collect ourselves here. Have a moment of silence. Before we have the moment of silence, I'm going to read a little a poem that's relevant to our subject today, and this is basically well, maybe I'm not reading that poem today. I had it set out. Here it is. Page 2. Okay, so this is a poem called Incantation by Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet. I shared it with the PCC chat listserv right after the Republican National Convention, and because it seemed so relevant to the whole issue of truth and deception, and what language, what words signify. And so the reason I wanted to read this poem today is that in certain ways it's a perfect bridge carrying both what we studied the first class, the Greeks, and this class, which is the biblical tradition. And this particular poem carries both a Platonic affirmation of a transcendent ground of reality, of being that holds the high values of life inviolate. And at the same time, it carries a biblical faith in the ultimate triumph of the truth and the good in an historical battle with evil and with deception. So, and the thing that you need to know about Czesław Miłosz is that this is a poet who lived through the heart of darkness in the 20th century in Eastern Europe, in Poland, through the Nazis, through the Holocaust, through the communist kind of series of catastrophes that he witnessed. And so he's carrying that at the same time as he's representing this kind of profound metaphysical and spiritual, religious root tradition or set of traditions that inform our civilization. Human reason is beautiful and invincible. No bars, no barbed wire, no pulping of books, no sentence of banishment can prevail against it. It establishes the universal ideas in language and guides our hand so that we write truth and justice with capital letters, lie and oppression with small. It puts what should be above things as they are. It is an enemy of despair and a friend of hope. It does not know Jew from Greek or slave from master, giving us the estate of the world to manage. It saves austere and transparent phrases from the filthy discord of tortured words. It says that everything is new under the sun, opens the congealed fist of the past. Beautiful and very young are philosophia and poetry, her ally in the service of the good. As late as yesterday, nature celebrated their birth. The news was brought to the mountains by a unicorn and an echo. Their friendship will be glorious. Their time has no limit. Their enemies have delivered themselves to destruction. Okay, let me just bring this over here. Sorry, piano. So, I'm going to, I want to say a word about what Czesław Miłosz is illuminating there with this poetry in relationship to what we discussed last 2 weeks ago. He's carrying both the Greek Platonic philosophical tradition so explicitly, setting those words and ideas like truth and justice into capital letters so that they attain a transcendent archetypal quality straight out of the Platonic dialogues. And he's also got this biblical sense of, he's even using biblical language, like it does not know Jew from Greek or slave from master, straight from the New Testament. It's an enemy of despair and a friend of hope, straight from the Hebrew Bible. And then it's all carried with this mythic, poetic, imaginative quality. Beautiful and very young are philosophia. Philo and Sophia are both capitalized with a hyphen between them. Love of wisdom, philosophia. And poetry, her ally in the service of the good. And then this beautiful sort of mythic resonance of, as late as yesterday, nature celebrated her birth. Yesterday. The news was brought to the mountains by a unicorn and an echo. And then back to the biblical language of their enemies have delivered themselves to destruction. Their friendship will be glorious. And their time has no limit. That has to be coming from a very deep spiritual ground and faith to say that in the face of what 20th century history in Europe, and particularly in Poland, in the years that he was there. That was translated, by the way, by Robert Pinsky, our American poet laureate, around the time that he translated it. With Czesław Miłosz, together they translated. I think Miłosz was in Berkeley at that point. Now, you can see how art carries so much more complexity than a prose statement can. He's just managed in this one poem to combine so many levels and such. It's so evocative, and that's the beauty of art. And Jean Cocteau once said, people say that art is a complicated way of saying simple things, but we know that art is a simple way of saying very complex things. And I want to draw on that. Here's that transcendent higher reality of the eternal that we spoke of last week, emerging out of that primal sense of the ensouled world, where there was much less differentiation, much more of the self and the human, the individual are all much more embedded in the whole. And then there's this great axial revolution that takes place, that the Greeks and the Hebrews are contemporary manifestations of in radically different ways, but both of them positing this tremendous transcendent higher locus of meaning and value that informs this world, that creates this world, that is timeless compared to the world of time, change, death, imperfection, and injustice. And here, we just to fill in that sort of spiral mandala that we discussed last time, where you've got the Cartesian modern radiant solar self, which will be the subject of next time we come together, but it's embedded now in a world that it feels essentially separate from, that it's become an object to the subject. And this was prepared for by the Axial revolution, where you had, put this over here for a second, and you have man made in the image of God in a way that the rest of the world is not in this understanding. So the human is differentiated. Now, what I was saying about Cocteau's point about the complexity of what can be conveyed through art, through poetry. It's also true of even like a visual diagram where so much is being, you've got the individual's relationship to the community, the separate individual of the modern, compared to the tribal identity. You've got the relationship of the human to nature carried here. You've got the relationship of the ego, the rational ego, the conscious ego to the unconscious. Each of these, there's different levels. There's the whole ecological dimension, the human's relationship to nature, to the cosmos, etc. Now, in this complexity, I want to just point out how and of course there's that one more where we're going down here to the kind of post-Nietzschean, post-modern speck of dust, meaning-seeking speck of dust. Remember Calvin, I'm significant, screamed the dust speck down here. But this is a much more ambiguous, multiple, indeterminate reality that we'll discuss much more fully as we move towards the final weeks. But I want to emphasize how much we all carry all of. Just take Czesław Miłosz's poem, how he is simultaneously carrying that both the Greek Platonic view and the biblical view of that axial religious philosophical awakening to a transcendent reality. So he starts out right away with that, but he does it with a very, in a sense, a totally modern statement of human reason is beautiful and invincible. This is that confidence in human reason, which is so strong at the birth of modernity, and is there in Descartes and Locke. It's there in our discussion right now. Our using words, concepts, ideas to try to grasp, articulate truth. That's coming from what Eric Voegelin called the noetic revolution that the Greeks brought, that awakening to reason as informing the whole cosmos, and that the human mind at its best could participate in. And it's also coming from the Judaic and Christian sense of confidence. This particularly was built up in the Middle Ages and the Scholasticism of the medieval period, of confidence in human reason as a gift of the divine reason, as a gift of God, and Aquinas's confidence that to know the world better and to develop human rationality was not a an act of defiance or irreverence against the divine. It was actually honoring the divine glory, both through better recognizing the intelligence that saturates the cosmos that God has created, but also as carrying enacting the glory of the human creature that the Creator has given such special qualities to. That to not develop, to not enact, embody, cultivate these qualities that are human is in some sense to diminish the glory of the divine itself, and it's not a zero-sum game. This is one of Aquinas' great contributions. He helps make possible really the modern. But I'm wanting to emphasize how that sense of confidence in human reason, even in the most secular version of it that we get in the late modern period, has an inheritance. It's a legacy, a spiritual legacy that's coming from the Axial period, and this is made explicit in the poem. And then, of course, he gives this mythic, the unicorn, the echo, the birth of poetry and philosophia, and nature celebrating that birth, and in this kind of mythic, magical form, with the axial, Greek and biblical, with modern reason, and he's carrying this treasure, this confidence, into the heart of darkness of the nihilistic Second World War Holocaust, and against the barbed wires, against the burning of books, against the bars of imprisonment. So I wanted to start with that acknowledgement of the continuing reality of all these levels, and then particularly this beautiful poetic statement of those different levels. And of course, you get shadow forms of all these in our contemporary world as well. You get the fundamentalist Christian, for example, still very politically active and potent in the American polis, for example. You certainly have very powerful modern perspective, modern scientific. You've got the postmodern and the deep a lot of the greatest thinkers, I think, and the greatest contributors to our spiritual and intellectual evolution in our time are distinguished by carrying all of these together in a way that is evolving all of them together, and it's not just in this kind of naive cutting off of one in order to favor the other. The way an adolescent cuts off, we as adolescents cut off our parents or grandparents or the tradition in order to define ourselves, but then the more mature synthesis comes along. And if you think about somebody like Jung, how much he was simultaneously living in an ensouled world with his synchronicities and his alchemy and I Ching and visiting the shamans in Africa or this American Southwest, and he's at the same time he's also writing Answer to Job and profoundly dealing with with that tradition and dreaming that tradition further. And he's also very much a modern scientist and person who's bringing enlightenment reason to the mysteries of the deep psyche. And he's also so postmodern. As soon as he says the God image, he's relativizing God. He's moving it from being the literal to being like, well, this is our take on whatever God is. And he does that with science as well. That's why he was so loyal to Kant, who's the turning point for this, as we'll see. Okay, so those are a few opening remarks about our journey today. Now, last class, 2 weeks ago, under the gentle sounds of the Blue Angels, I spoke about how each new epoch that we're studying, each new worldview, is initiated by a sacrifice. There's a sacrificial figure who goes down, to use Nietzsche's phrase, who goes through some kind of a trial, of a condemnation, an imprisonment or an execution, a death, a descent into a kind of some form of annihilation takes place. And I spoke of, for example, both like Socrates and Jesus representing that transition to the axial religious metaphysical awakening, Galileo the transition to the modern, and Nietzsche as the transition to the postmodern. Now, and just to fill in that picture, as we did last week, it's not a direct leap from this more egalitarian, in every sense, tribal primordial worldview, where it could be said, we are the salmon, we are the streams, we are the mountain. There was that intermediate stage that was absolutely essential to the creation or discovery of a transcendent universal reality, which was provided by the archaic period, in particularly as it influenced Western civilization, the background in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and you've got that symbol of the pyramid, where you have the God-King complex, as Robert Bellah calls it, where this divine reality is basically appropriated by or owned by or mediated by, depending on your point of view, one person, the king, the emperor, the pharaoh. In earlier forms of this archaic society, it's chiefdoms, where there's a single powerful person who is both the mediator of the divine and has religious authority in ritual settings, but it also has the political authority. And this reaches tremendously powerful, complex proportions in the height of ancient Egypt, Babylon, the Sumerian, the Akkadian, and so forth. And this is what happens with the great shift, for example, in Israel is, as I think I mentioned last time, where the prophet can say to the king of Israel, yes, you're really powerful, but your power is nothing compared to the King of Kings. You're a king, but there's a King of Kings who has the ultimate authority and defines what is really just and what is really good. And so the Hebrew prophet can critique the political status quo, and that starts at, because he has had a direct illumination, a direct relationship to the transcendent reality. Here I'm going to draw so that we've got it here clearly in our mind. An individual prophet, or in Greece, philosopher, or in China, the sage, or in India, the mystic, has a direct illumination of a divine transcendent reality, and that gives this individual an authority to judge the political status quo, the society, the conventional society, and conventional moral values. It gives us leverage to make changes against a different standard, a higher standard, rather than where your reality, your social political reality, is so identified with the religious spiritual reality that there's no leverage that you can have. You are in it. It's a, what Vogelin calls, a compact cosmology. There's losses and gains at every stage. The compact cosmology has this great value of souled and inspirited and conjoined together, and one lives in a meaningful cosmos, and etc. But there's all sorts of prices that are paid as well, particularly as human civilization becomes more complex, resources become more abundant, social organization becomes more hierarchical, military and political power gets concentrated in a hierarchy for various reasons, and this is associated with religious transformations. The great book that has beautifully analyzed this, I think I mentioned it last time, is Robert Bella's Religion in Human Evolution, from the Paleolithic to the Axial era, and it's a masterwork of synthesis of decades and decades of scholarship. Okay, so I'm mentioning these sacrifices that were made, and one of the things that these sacrificial figures, these turning points, these basically solar heroes, in Socrates, Jesus, Galileo, Nietzsche. I want to also emphasize how each one was a culmination of the tradition that brought them forth. So they're not only they not only represent a paradigm shift, a break from the tradition, they also represent a climax of that tradition. Socrates is carrying everything of Greek civilization in him. As a public citizen of the Athenian polis, as a thoughtful, philosophical person, as an athlete, as a warrior, he's got all these things going for him, and he's carrying it. He's the culmination of the Greek cultural project, and then he makes this shift. It transforms itself in him as a vessel, and Jesus is the same thing in Israel. Nietzsche so much is carrying everything that comes before him. He's got the Greek tradition, he's got the biblical, He's got the enlightenment, the philosophical enlightenment is so strong in him. He knows the science, but he's also a romantic. He loves, Wagner and Beethoven, music, poetry. So he's carrying everything with him and then moves it to another level. Now, behind these kind of mythic figures they're in both traditions, in Greece and in Israel, there are, in a sense, actual mythic figures who carry the same archetypal quality. In Greece, it's Prometheus, the great rebel titan who stands up to the old gods and represents the birth of a new form of human being. In fact, in some of the myths, he is the creator of the human, but he is he's the rebel, he's the liberator, and he suffers. He is punished and is on the rock of the Caucasus. He's chained to the rock where the eagle eats his liver. And in Israel, in the biblical tradition, it's Adam and Eve who are the ones who do the rebellion and go down, and they mediate the mediate a birth of a new form of consciousness at the same time as they and it's a defiance of the old order, and they experience the loss of the primal. That's, in a sense, the primal innocence. Suddenly, they have to wear clothes. I was thinking about that. You don't see any other animal species just sort of spontaneously dressing up. It's such a human phenomenon, and it's so, in some sense, biblical in a way that we cover ourselves that way. So, what I'm attempting to kind of to depict is the ways in which archetypal processes, almost mythic processes, seem to be at work, and in fact, in our civilization's spiritual and intellectual evolution. And we have these great mythic forms and figures, such as Prometheus and Genesis, the creation, Adam and Eve, etc., that carry these archetypal patterns explicitly, and then they're lived out in our civilization's history, where there's the loss of a defiance of the gods of the old order, and a loss of the old unity, but the birth through suffering and death and an ordeal and initiation. It allows a new conjunctio oppositorum, a new sacred marriage. Jesus brings heaven and earth together in a new way. He brings heaven and earth, human and divine, life and death. It's a synthesis of opposites. And Socrates did the exact same thing. He brings heaven and earth together in a new way. He brings the human and divine together in a new way. And he brings death and life together in a new way. Death is seen as an entrance to larger, deeper life. That's why he's so confident to go into it. And even if anybody doesn't have a syllabus that wants one, I've got them here. A few more, so come up after, I guess, if you want one. a second little announcement. I happened to mention Eric Vogelin twice in the first part of the lecture, and it happens that there's going to be a lecture at PCC Forum tonight on Eric Vogelin's work. Vogelin's one of these kind of great scholars and historians, intellectual, philosophical historians. And Paul Carangella is the speaker. He's devoted his life to Vogelin's work, and Brian Swim's introducing him. And it will be in the I don't know, Becca, I think it's in room 212 at 6:30 today, for those of you who have any capacity at all for after 3 hours of lecture to hear more. And then one other question that someone mentioned is about the exam and paper. First of all, because this is a one-unit class, it will not be a huge thing, and the exam will be short, either very short sentences or a paragraph type of answer. And if you've been to the lectures and you read the book, you're covered. I mean, it's not that I'm not out to. It's a pass-fail course. And my general philosophy about graduate education is, by this time, you're in it for the love of it, and not to have some external superego trying to, discipline you to finally get working. So that's my philosophy about it. And the paper, which will be quite brief, will be your opportunity to take any one of the answers that you gave to the questions in the exam, which is not going to occupy a big part of the class, because we've only got 5 classes, and I don't want to just spend it all on, it's just a short part of the 5th class. But if there's any answers that you'd like to develop further, that you'd like to elaborate, that will be what you can do in the paper, or you can choose something different as well. But that's the basic idea. Okay. So let me just mention one thing about the way the course is structured, because I separated out the 5 meetings of the class so that you don't have 5 in a row. You have a few weeks in between, or sometimes 2 weeks, but I think in this next case, I think you've got 3 weeks till the next class. And so to give more opportunity to do the reading. I realize, compared to many of your other classes where you're meeting every week, and some of the classes have substantial reading indeed, that this isn't a huge amount of reading, but it does require, I certainly aspired to be as clear and intelligible in the writing as possible, but it does require a certain focus, and that's why reading a few pages a day is often the best way. 10, 20 pages a day, and you can take in a lot, assimilate it, and then come back for more. The strange thing about Passion of the Western Mind is that I began it with the intention of simply summarizing a few basic aspects of Western intellectual history. I had planned this would be a couple of chapters of Cosmos and Psyche, and it was going to be, I just wanted to set out, okay, I wanted to set out the difference between Platonic archetypes and Jungian archetypes, and to understand that, I needed to bring in Aristotle and the great, the battle during the medieval period between nominalism and realism, which you just read about, and then the whole revolution of thought that made the psychological approach to archetypes necessary compared to the metaphysical one that Plato had available to him. But I just had in mind first doing that, and setting out also the Copernican revolution, so that I had a basis for discussing cosmological issues. But what happened in a mysterious way as I was writing was it's like a kind of, part of it was as I came to understand a more complex and nuanced, rich reality that I wanted to convey, a narrative started emerging. It became a drama and not just a set of, okay, here's this idea and here's that philosophy, etc. It became a narrative drama to the point where as I began each day of writing, I felt like, you know, one almost had to invoke a muse, the muses, the way poets would in the past, to help one tell the story. So that's why Passion reads something like a kind of epic novel, and I know like both Joe Campbell and Baring mentioned something like that, and it has to do with this, my sense that this is really in a way a philosophy of intellectual history and in itself, and that is I see these ideas and these impulses, religious, philosophical, scientific, they're all carried by flesh and blood human beings who are embedded in a drama of history, and they're usually working through something that's very, like, they're dealing with specific problems and issues. They're not just thinking, okay, what am I going to come up with for a new philosophical idea? They're gripped by a concrete issue that then is the grain of sand in the oyster shell that it's the grain of sand that becomes the pearl, you know, and what you've read as of this point is basically you now have the foundation for the dramatic narrative, and for the rest of the book and our course moves rather quickly as modern history gets so filled up with more rapid developments and more characters, more impulses are at work. So we kind of had to have these two great root streams articulated first, and these earlier epochs. So you've got this interesting parallel between Jesus and Socrates, these two figures who neither of them left anything written. So it's interesting that they're both, we only know them through their followers, their disciples. And both of them have a kind of shamanic quality too. They're both rabbis, professor, rebel types, or rebel professor, rebel rabbi teacher, and they were in the oral tradition, and so there's that interesting parallel that these two sort of founders of whole modes of being and worldviews didn't leave one word in written form. Now, the history that you were reading about in this last segment, the last couple of weeks, is one of dominated particularly by two enormously powerful figures, Paul and Augustine. And I tried to convey in each case how these particular men carried certain complexities in their life history and their character that was crucial for what unfolded through them. The fact that Paul was simultaneously Greek by education, Roman by citizenship, and Jewish by religion is crucial for his capacity to carry a synthesis into the Roman Empire that had such impact. And you see this also with Augustine. Augustine is one of these people who's carrying everything that preceded him. He studied carefully, Platonism, and he's taken in, Gnosticism and skepticism, and he's also, again, he actually was a professor and a kind of bon vivant figure in Milan and the teaching rhetoric. And there's a certain way in which, in the contradictions of his character, which were he was so spiritual and so instinctual at the same time, and he was having a very difficult time bringing these together. And in some sense, and I follow Jung in this analysis, I think Jung's right when he said, in some sense there had to be a kind of, in that state of the Roman imperial world, where instinct was in some sense running amok, there had to be a tremendous differentiation and a kind of attempt to control an instinct through mind and spirit, and that duality plays a huge role from then on. And St. Augustine in some ways can be seen as carrying, he's simultaneously so ancient and medieval and modern. It's very interesting, this one person. He's the most articulately self-reflective sensibility of his era. There's nothing like Augustine's Confessions in the history of ancient literature. He's got a self-awareness that, it's actually, he's the one who says, when we get to Descartes, and when Descartes says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, which was part of an argument that was basically, I doubt, therefore I am. Right? We'll get to that. That was Augustine's argument. That was he's taking that straight from Augustine. Augustine had thought these things through. He's such an ancient. He's so immersed in the philosophical and religious currents of his time, but he brings forth a sensibility and a vision that just is so potently articulate that it shapes the medieval period for 1,000 years. Both Aquinas and Augustine both Aquinas and Luther looked to Augustine as absolutely crucial. The Augustinian, in fact, Augustine plays a huge role in the Protestant Reformation. And he's so medieval with that sense of, but he's medieval before the fact. In some sense, his sensibility shapes the medieval era, so he seems very medieval in that sense of the Manichaean battle between good and evil, and the association of a sort of hovering sense of the supernatural that is behind our life in this world and the moral drama that we are in, and the sense of sin and salvation, and also the tremendous conviction that an institutional church was going to be necessary to hold the religious, the precious religious treasure that had come from the Gospels, that it was going to be necessary to bring it into the new era. An institution would be necessary. All that is very Augustinian. But at the same time, he's so modern. He's essentially a kind of existentialist, and he's people still now, when James Hillman is writing about the nature of the soul and the nature of memory, he goes right to Augustine, because Augustine is so introspective and deep. So he's quite a person. So let's look at the Christian summary that I give at the just before moving into the Middle Ages, and it's that chapter called A Summing Up. And again, I just set out 5 or 6 basic principles here that characterize that transition from the ancient to, from particularly the ancient Greek to the medieval Christian mindset. First, it's to establish a monotheistic hierarchy in the cosmos through the recognition of one supreme God, the triune creator and Lord of history. Okay, so this is a very potent affirmation of this, of a transcendent reality in the form of a single being, a monotheistic transcendent. It was also as 3 persons in one God. There's also angels. There's saints. There's it's as Joseph Campbell said, like from a certain point of view, this is hardly a negation of polytheism, but at another level, it is highly. It is a tremendous psycho-spiritual move towards a singular transcendent reality. It is compacting the ultimate identity of our even human identity into a single being, which is not unlike, for example, what the Roman Empire is doing with its imperial civilization, and why the Roman Catholic Church could come out of that synthesis. This is something that James Hillman, of course, is critiquing with his affirmation of the polytheistic soul against the monotheistic ego that is, he felt, not only has that Christian and Hebraic background, but also a Roman imperial background too. But this is a move towards the unitive egoic identity that is central to the modern identity and that we each have. Okay? Because the image of the divine is always an anticipation of what the human is moving towards and aspiring towards. The second is to reinforce Platonism's spirit-matter dualism, because obviously Plato really had that, but it infuses it with the doctrine of original sin, the fall of man and nature, and collective human guilt. So it takes on it takes on both a moral intensity and an historical dimension. And gradually, by largely severing from nature any immanent divinity, whether animistic, I could have put that too, really, animistic, polytheistic, or pantheistic. And at the same time, though, the medieval mind very much has the world with an aura of supernatural significance. And that significance could be theistic or satanic, good or evil. Both are very intensely present. And there's a radical polarization between good and evil, much more than is characteristic of the Greeks. Good and evil, this is more coming from the Zoroastrianism, dualism, that coming out of Persia, that both the Jews and the Christians pick up. And then they combine that sense of the metaphysical battle of good and evil with, number 3, dramatizing the relation of the transcendent to the human, which had more of a kind of timeless and almost philosophical equanimity or equilibrium in terms of the Platonic view. In the Christian and Judaic view, but we're especially now looking at the Christian spiritual impulse that runs through the Middle Ages. That dramatization of the relationship of the transcendent to this world is done in terms of God's rulership of history. History. That's different than the focus on the cosmos that the Greeks had. The focus is now on history. Remember that act of will that the divine has in the Jewish consciousness. And there's a narrative that goes with it of the chosen people. See, in a sense, this is not only the individual prophet having that special relationship to God, but this is also the chosen people. This is Israel, separate from all the other forms of humanity, all the other nations. But it will become a light to the world. That's a light that it is receiving from its special relationship to God, the ruler of history. And in the Christian transformation of the Jewish religion, the historical appearance of Christ on earth and his eventual reappearance to save mankind in a future apocalyptic age. So all this introduces a sense of historical dynamism. See, very different from that, as I say, that kind of timeless, ahistorical equanimity that is more characteristic of the Greeks. Not entirely. The Greeks have, with Prometheus, particularly with the 5th century Enlightenment, you get a sense of civilizational progress. It's in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, for example. He specifically talks about a sense of civilization's progress out of a state of savagery that he, Prometheus, mediated through giving humanity the control of fire against the God's will. Okay, so the Greeks did have a nascent sense of progress, but it's overall there is more of a cyclical understanding, and in the Platonic view, it's also got this kind of ahistorical, transcendent archetypal quality that with Judaism and Christianity suddenly there's an arrow of history, there's an arrow of time, and in a sense, this diagram here is a kind of combination of the two, where you're getting simultaneously the cyclical view of history, but it's also a spiral. It's an evolution is taking place. You never come back right to the same place. An evolution of consciousness has taken place, which permits an entirely new mode of being, which is not nevertheless recapitulating what has preceded it. And this sense of historical dynamism is connected to a divine redemptive logic in history that's linear rather than cyclical. Yet, gradually, it relocated this redemptive force in the ongoing institutional church, and that implicitly restored a more static understanding of history. Every once in a while you'd get these eruptions of a more apocalyptic historical sense, but the church, for typical institutional reasons, and perhaps others as well, like to keep things stable and say, everything's under control, the world's not going to end tomorrow. Fourth, it absorbed and transformed the pagan mother goddess mythology into an historicized Christian theology with the Virgin Mary as the human mother of God. That's why Charlene Spretnak could write that book a few years ago called Missing Mary, about, the subtitle was The Goddess of the West, Mary as the Goddess of the West. And in many parts of medieval Catholicism and also Catholicism today, Mary, in some sense, almost supersedes the presence of the masculine forms of the divinity of God the Father or Christ. You go certain like cathedrals in Mexico, you're clearly in a goddess religion. Virgin Mary is a huge, dominant, iconic presence, and God the Father and Jesus are off to the side. And there's a great, it's a kind of, it's an icon in a cathedral in France where the Virgin, it shows the Virgin Mary like this, and you open it up, and inside is the whole drama of creation. God the Father creating the world, the Christ on the cross, the Holy Spirit. The whole thing is inside the Mother Goddess. Okay, it's a great image. You can see. I think Sean Kelly describes it in his book Coming Home, but I first ran into it in the lectures of Joseph Campbell, and I think there's many years ago, and I think there's an image of it. There is in the Masks of God, that 4-volume work of Campbell's, the volume called Occidental Mythology, which means Western mythology. It's in that one, and it's great to see it. So the peoples of Europe couldn't, go too long without some. Like, you've got to have, God the Father's got to have a partner, right? I mean, where's the fertility? Where's the children coming from, etc. The whole natural yearning for wholeness is going to bring forth out of the people, as it were, out of the collective psyche, rather than from the Vatican hierarchy, a sense of the feminine dimension of the divine, and so it became a lived reality, and then eventually received more and more theological treatment, climaxing, as Jung pointed out, with the Assumption of Mary, the Assumptio Mariae dogma that was proclaimed in 1950 by the Pope, which Jung saw as a sign of the transformation of human consciousness that would happen in our time, of a potentially of a elevation of the feminine to its rightful place, and a potential of a sacred marriage. Next, but this is connected to a continuing this Mother Goddess mythology also gets absorbed by the Mother Church, right? So you've got the Mother Church, again, a very strong feminine metaphor, and it's also visible in every time you go into a cathedral. I mean, if you go, those great cathedrals, Chartres, Notre Dame, these are great sort of sacral uterine structures with the luminous and numinous stained glass windows letting in the light and creating this womb-like quality that holds the sacred in ritual space. And in some sense, you can see that the cathedrals, which are, of course, as you see on the cover here, the great symbol, as the pyramids were for the archaic Egypt civilization, the cathedrals are the great symbol of Christian civilization of the Middle Ages, particularly the High Middle Ages, and they are, in some sense, embodying this reality of how much the Catholic Church served as the womb of Western civilization that eventually became a contracting womb, as what it had been gestating got so developed that it was ready to be born. And that's where I left you, I think, at the end of the reading for this week, was that moment at the threshold where it can no longer be contained by the Church, and there's about to be a convulsion out of the old cosmic ecclesiastical womb. And just finally, the couple epistemological points. Fifth, to diminish the value of observing, analyzing, understanding the natural world. This is particularly the first half of the Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages, the shifts, as you recall, when you get this, to Scholasticism, an increasingly empirical scientific mentality starts to emerge, particularly with Albertus Magnus, Aquinas, Roger Bacon in the 13th century, and even more developing in the 14th until by the time of the 15th, 16th centuries, it's erupting in the scientific revolution. But during the larger Christian tendency was definitely towards negating or diminishing the importance of that, and also to negate or de-emphasize the rational empirical faculties in favor of the emotional, the moral, and the spiritual sensibilities. And all human faculties are encompassed by the demands of Christian faith and subordinated to the will of God. And 6, to renounce the human capacity for independent intellectual or spiritual penetration of the world's meaning in deference to the absolute authority of the Church and Holy Scripture for the final definition of truth. Okay, so that's all the case, and yet there are counter trends in the medieval period towards these. For example, St. Francis of Assisi, for example, his splendid, in a sense, efflorescence of a sense of the ensouled nature and the sacred dignity of all living beings. And you also see, in terms of the patriarchal suppression of the feminine that is so characteristic of the Vatican in so many ways. I've mentioned, of course, the Virgin Mary and Mother Church and the cathedrals, but you've also got the troubadours. You've got the romantic idealism of the poets and minstrels, but you also have an erotic realism in medieval culture that's very pronounced. And even though there's this great thrust towards the spiritual transcendent, this world is still filled with relics and sacred places and processions and rituals and pilgrimages are just essential qualities of the daily experience of the medieval Christians. So in some sense, they are living in an enchanted world and not in a disenchanted world. It's just that the emphasis is always, like the cathedrals, aspiring up towards the transcendent. But clearly, compared to the Protestant Reformation, Roman Catholicism, even to this day, but particularly in the medieval period, is much closer to the primal, animistic, archaic, polytheistic. See, when the Protestant Reformation comes, you know, all the Virgin Mary, the saints, the relics, the Mass, the magic of the Eucharist, and all that. There's a kind of profound both desacralization of this world to serve the greater glory of God, and a kind of puritanical, you know, get those images out of here, and, you know, kind of literal iconoclasm, you know. Anyway, that's next time when we discuss this Protestant Reformation. But I'm wanting to emphasize that Christianity has these different inflections, and Catholicism is, in this sense, much closer to earlier sensibilities than the Protestant Reformation, which is a profound move towards the modern, including the individual believer separate from the womb of the church, as having a direct relationship to God. I think it was Erich Fromm, the psychoanalyst, who said that and Jung has said similar things, that basically Catholicism was like a kind of efflorescence of the mother goddess in counterpoint to the Judaic Yahweh. And then the Protestant Reformation was a reassertion of the paternal, patriarchal, masculine side of the divinity. And of course, Jung, in Answer to Job, says, does the Protestant religion want to bear the opprobrium of being nothing but a man's religion? But of course, the Protestant Reformation it's more complex than that. And of course, only a Protestant like Jung would deliver such a intense critique. But Protestantism made Jung possible, right? Even though he's celebrating this other side of Christianity, going back to the Catholics. I also want to emphasize how much there is a sense of the forgiving God, the loving God, along with the punitive one. That the fear of God and the love of God, the wrath of God, these are counterpoised, and it's not just like the Old Testament is the severe and the loving, forgiving is the New Testament. I mean, of course, there's truth in that with certainly Jesus' whole sensibility, but it's not. But both testaments carry both, and the Hebrew Bible has so many expressions of the divine love and care, even though it is often intensely outweighed by this kind of punitive, militaristic, almost sense of like a betrayed husband towards their spouse or something. It has that quality too, because there was archetypally something going on there between Israel and Yahweh, and in some sense, Mary is the incarnation of Israel, who Yahweh marries and gives birth to the new era in Christ. All right, then we go from there to Scholasticism, which is essentially in a characteristic. I mean, it starts with the Augustine and the other earlier theologians, but it really takes off in the High Middle Ages. And Scholasticism has been called the greatest social engine for the forging of a rigorous rational intellect that had ever been seen in history. And if you read the scholastic treatises, they have that quality of highly subtle and keen intelligence at work. And part of the reason they're doing that is they're trying to come to an understanding of how to synthesize their Greek philosophical inheritance from Plato and Aristotle with the gospel and with the scripture, which is so undeniable, which is infallible, and how to bring those together.
Quick question: where does that come? Where did they develop scholasticism out of at that point? Is it coming somewhat from the Arabic holding of the Greek tradition, or
Yeah.
what is the source of that?
Well, it's the question had to do with what is the root of scholasticism? It goes back to the Christian, the ancient Christian task of integrating itself into classical culture. And if you were an intelligent Christian, you wanted to be able to have a dialogue with and even integrate the best of Greek thought. And eventually, the great people like Augustine and Clement of Alexandria, Origen, these were extremely subtle minds who were very well educated, and they were doing the integration. So there was an impulse to integrate reason with faith. And that's the driving impulse of scholasticism from the beginning. And so it's there from the beginning, and it's there in the monasteries from like 6th century, 7th century. St. Benedict is 529 AD when he founds the first monastery, which is the same year that the Christian Roman emperor closed the last academic school from the pagan philosophy, 529. And then, but okay, you have to remember just how much Europe in the so-called Dark Ages, which would be, approximately from the fall of the Roman Empire to 1000, the fall of the Western Roman Empire from approximately 5th century to about 1000 AD. And then during that time, it's the Byzantine and the Islamic cultures that are really cooking and flourishing, and they're holding the Greek inheritance and developing it in different ways, and particularly the Islamic philosophers, and Maimonides is the most significant one, who saw the need to integrate Greek philosophy with the Jewish faith, and so he provided a paradigm for Aquinas and the other Greek, the other Christian scholastics in Europe. So they take in what Islam has been doing, and the crucial cultural epicenter is Spain, where the Arab, the Muslim, and the European Christians and the Jews are all in interaction, and like approximately around the 10th century, and that's where the translations start happening. And as a result of the translations coming of Aristotle in particular, that was the turning point, into Europe, everything shifted, because they just suddenly were encountering this unbelievably powerful intelligence that clearly had thought about a lot of things that they hadn't thought about, and had thought about it very clearly. And so they absorbed that, and integrating Aristotle was I think I mentioned this metaphor that was first used by, I think it was Joseph Pieper, spelled P-I-E-P-E-R, the German scholar, where he said it's like Aquinas. I think it was him. It might have been M.D. Chenu. Actually, as I'm thinking about it, it might be Chenu. It was one of these two great scholars, a Frenchman or a German. He said Aquinas was like Odysseus, who took the bow of, on the one hand, reason represented by Aristotle and Greek philosophy, and faith represented by the gospel, and he, with superhuman strength of mind, he strung the bow, and this metaphor wasn't followed through. You can basically see that it's out of that bow that the arrow of modern civilization comes. I mean, modernity is a consequence of the combination of Greco-Roman with Judeo-Christian and the Germanic peoples combining and bringing forth this extraordinary phenomenon of modernity. I mentioned nominalism versus realism a few minutes ago, just to click that in your mind. Like, that is, in certain respects, the central controversy of medieval thought, because realism, the way they're using the word real, shows you where the medieval sensibility was. What was real was the archetypal, the spiritual, the timeless, the transcendent. This world of particulars was not so real. Okay, so it's a Platonic kind of realism, and this world is seen as more derivative. But nominalism is that philosophical perspective that starts to emerge robustly in the High Middle Ages as a counterpoint, because in that view, I don't want to say because, but in that view, it's the particular that's real, and the general idea is something that the human mind is creating and giving a name to. That's what nominalism means. It's giving a name to this general idea of what, for the Platonic perspective, was the actual reality. The archetypal horse was more real than the individual horses. The archetypal human is more real than individual humans. Archetypal beauty is more real than the beauty that comes and goes in a person's life or in a flower. But there's timeless archetypal beauty that is changeless and eternal. So it was a clash between these two very different perspectives. And what you're seeing in the great conflict of nominalism and realism is, I believe, a shift of consciousness is taking place spontaneously in the nascent, in the High Middle Ages, which is bringing forth the nascent modern mind, of this world becoming more and more real, tangible, visible, and the supernatural is starting to withdraw from its consciousness, the intimacy with it, until you get to a full-fledged secular modern perspective. The supernatural is one big delusion. What were these people thinking, right? But if you were to talk to a medieval person about, well, do you really think the devil is real? They'd say, excuse me? You would question, your sanity would be questioned. The supernatural was very ontologically vivid. Okay, and finally we get at the end of this section that you've been reading that remarkable recovery of classical humanism. The great literature of ancient Greece becomes more accessible, partly as a result of the influx of scholars from Constantinople. When the conquest of Constantinople happened by the Turks, all these scholars migrate into Italy, and also they bring manuscripts with them, and basically, after a powerful influx of the Aristotelian tradition during the High Middle Ages, suddenly Plato becomes more vivid. I mean, they only had, I think, the Timaeus and parts of a couple of other dialogues for much of the Middle Ages, and then suddenly they're getting all the dialogues, and Ficino is the guy who translates them all into Latin, and that's in the 1470s, 1480s, in the court of the Medici in Florence, and so you get this, in a sense, high culture just starts. I mean, Dante's already carrying. He's sort of like the fullness of the medieval is in him, and then Petrarch is climbs that mountain, and he's the movement into the new sensibility and the appreciation of classical humanism, and you start getting a new sense of a rebirth of culture that Petrarch is feeling, and then really rises to the fore in the 15th century. And Ficino and Pico are key figures in that. Okay, so let's, any comments, thoughts, questions about what we've been discussing or what you read? Please, Jahan.
Two groups of people. There's like the concrete people and the transcendentalists, or the romantics and enlightenments. Like there's like two categories that like run through like the stream of history. And I'm trying to figure out, like, are those personality types or predispositions? Because they're not paradigms. They're like two camps that are always going back and forth. So what are they? Are they personalities or predispositions or?
And how did you characterize them at the very beginning between the two? What are the two?
Either concrete and transcendental,
Yeah.
or there's like the romantics and enlightenment, or there's like
Yeah.
the particulars and the
Good.
the
Yeah.
wholes and-
Well, I think entire eras will be will take on the dominance of one of those over another. But the way I would approach it is that reality's radically pluralistic, and it reveals itself to different eras and different sensibilities in different ways. I believe there's a kind of evolutionary meaning to why it seems to disclose itself in one way versus another way at different eras or to different individuals. But the notion of typology, which Jung, for example, did with respect to the introverted and the extroverted, which has some relationship to this transcendent and physical particular dichotomy, is I think a valid one. That there are certain typological tendencies there. I love that painting of Raphael's that kind of captures that in this kind of elegant symmetry of, it's called the School of Athens, and it's in the Vatican, and Plato is pointing towards the transcendent as the ultimate reality, and then Aristotle's right next to him, gesturing out with his hand towards this world. And the two together, in a sense, represent the whole in a certain way, at least that particular polarity, beautifully. But as I will suggest as we keep going in the future weeks, I don't think it's merely a kind of either random or statically cyclical movement between, like a swinging of the pendulum back and forth. I think something else is happening, and here I would agree with people like Rudolf Steiner or Owen Barfield, who discern a certain movement from, like, first there is a differentiation of the transcendent, and then it incarnates. And so the reason that an entire era would experience this world as being so much more potently, ontologically real compared with another era which would experience gods and goddesses or a transcendent deity who was way more real than anything here. These, I think, reflect a larger evolution of consciousness that may have something to do with a kind of incarnational process. So, okay, please.
I have two questions. My first one is...
Sure. Say it loud enough so everybody can hear.
Yeah. The first one is that I grew up in Spain, which is a Catholic country, and the word soul and spirit, sometimes I have heard these two words like used in referring to the same thing.
Yes.
And I am confused about the meaning of these two words, both in Plato and Aristotle, because I've seen in your book that you use also these two words.
Right.
They were the same?
Yes. The sharp differentiation between soul and spirit is something that particularly became kind of topical and theorized through the work of James Hillman, and he has very powerful essay on soul and spirit. It's called Peaks and Valleys. And of course, he's all totally on the side of soul, which he sees as being more the sense of the psychological embeddedness in this world of our emotions and imagination and messiness and feeling. And spirit is this, he sees soul as being more, in a sense, polytheistic, and spirit as being more monotheistic and connected to the mind. And the word in German, Geist, has both spirit and mind as potential translations. And so he sees it more, that spirit is more characteristic of the north of the Alps, and south of the Alps, the Mediterranean, has more emphasis on soul. And so his allegiance is very much to soul. Okay, so now there's others who would argue that soul and spirit shouldn't be, are not so sharply differentiated, and that, and then in the Catholic tradition, for example, that's dominant in Spain's history, like soul is not so much something like that Plato would be talking about, like the anima mundi, for example, but it's more like we each have a soul. It's like we have a kind of substance that is particular to us, your soul, and your soul is what lasts. It's instead of a dimension of being that would be more the Neoplatonic view, that soul is the animate, living, the dimension of existence. So it's a tricky area, soul and spirit. I'll try to be clear when I'm when I'm using those words as to the different connotations. But I personally, while Hillman was a huge influence on me, I am grateful to him. In some ways, he brought a dualistic sword into the whole soul-spirit discussion, which was helpfully illuminating and at the same time perhaps not adequately in his tremendous antagonism to monotheism, Christianity, the spiritual transcendent, the up and out, redemptive, mystical unity. He's just not into that. He wants to live. And so he captured the word soul for a different purpose. And I think it's characteristic of geniuses like Hillman to be blind to certain aspects of reality in order to more vividly bring to us a dimension that we had been inadequately sensitive to. Oh yeah, you had two questions.
Well, the second one is, perhaps it's easier, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit or the Spirit is
Yes.
also the archetype of what, how the divine can relate to or be embedded into the matter, and could be the same, could be the Holy Mother or the Virgin Mary incarnate the same archetype or the same meaning?
Yes. In in different renderings of the Christian theology that are not so orthodox but are deep and profound, there you have the second and third person of the Trinity will be seen as being like the masculine and feminine hands of the non-dual deity, and Jung develops that whole relationship of the Holy Spirit to Sophia and to the Virgin Mary and the feminine dimension of the divine, and the Holy Spirit bloweth where it willeth, as the Bible puts it, and it's the Holy Spirit that comes into the human community at Pentecost, and that spirit of love and inspiration, community, is a gift of the Holy Spirit and is the presence of the Holy Spirit. And in some ways, you could say that what the Protestant Reformation represented was a more robust affirmation that the Holy Spirit could not be held by an institution. Almost said a constitution. How much our Constitution has this kind of patriarchal sacred authority that is just immovable in our national psyche too, with really problematic consequences. Anyway, Constitution, institution, Catholic Church, and the Protestant Reformation says, you know, the Holy Spirit brings fresh infusions of our connection to the divine in ways that cannot be contained by any structure, and there's also this connection of the Holy Spirit to the feminine dimension of the divine that if you read Answer to Job by Jung, he discusses this in a very original way. Thanks for those questions. Yes?
Hi, moving back into the Christian era a little bit. On page 118 in your writings, you mentioned that this was the time that Christianity moved into and suppressed the more esoteric schools like the Gnostic movements.
Yes.
Now, did this include also the books of Enoch that were held sacred by some of the early Hebrew prophets? Because they were suppressed at some time.
Yeah.
Even banned.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not controlling, as Robert McDermott would say, like that particular piece. I'm trying to remember where the Book of Enoch fits in the canon. You know, when the canon was established in the later classical period.
He was the grandfather of Moses, I believe. You know. So.
Yeah, but in terms of the biblical the book as to what decisions were made for what to be canonical and what weren't. I mean, it's very much in the news right now with, you know, the recovery of this little fragment that talks about Jesus speaking of having a wife. Harvard Divinity School scholar has published a paper about it, and of course it got lots of interest. It's fragmentary, but there's a huge amount of literature from other sources, Gnostic and in particular, that were basically not included in the canon. There was a very helpful but somewhat tendentious reading of it of this drama was Elaine Pagel's book on the Gnostic Gospels, and she's got lots of insights. I mean, there's people who will critique some of her conclusions, but it still was a very valuable work. And in some sense, you could say that there was I want to just basically try to hold the ambiguity of the Catholic Church's decision about what to include and what not to, because on the one hand there was a suppression of the imaginative and spiritual plurality and unconstrainedness of the spiritual imagination in the later classical era, like 2nd century AD. Things were just really cooking in the Gnostic imagination, and then there was a decision to kind of limit it to the 4 Gospels, the letters of Paul, and so forth, that became canonical. And one of the reasons that this was done was to keep things clearer and more simple. It was partly an act of, it could be seen as a very problematic and oppressive act. In other ways, though, a lot of the Gnostic literature was emphasizing even more dualism, and that this world was radically fallen, in a way that even to the point of saying that the creator of this world was basically an inferior deity. And what the Catholic Church wanted to do was to establish a continuity from the God of the Hebrew Bible to the God of the New Testament, and say, so there was an affirmation of the goodness of creation, basically. And so anyway, the whole issue of Gnosticism is a complex one, and the issue of the non-canonical books is also, there's more details to it than I currently have in my mastery right now. But that would be a good, I'd be very interested if you care to pursue that in like your paper or anything like that.
Rick, this question was kind of in my mind when Chad asked about Islam. I'm just kind of been trying to think how to phrase this, but I'm kind of always awed, I could say, by the sort of depth of this vision as a picture of Western history. I don't think at all you were saying this, but Islamic culture was more than a kind of holding vessel until Europe, until Western Europe sort of returned to those ideas, and in particular, I mean, it had connections to Indian and Chinese ideas and technology, and there's a whole narrative of flow of information in both directions along the Silk Road for many thousands of years. And mathematics, I think, particularly is interesting with this, because you could, if you sort of look at mathematics as we have it now, it doesn't just come from the West or the classical tradition. It's really a creation of the whole Eurasian world, zero from India. So I guess what I'm sort of wondering is how you see this narrative picture you're drawing in terms of the broader, I suppose, Eurasian evolution and interpenetration of ideas.
Yeah, I definitely didn't. I think particularly while the Byzantine civilization, to some extent, did more of a holding job, though it also had its theological and artistic creativity, and it also carried a certain dimension of the Christian revelation that was lost by the Augustinian focus on a more juridical Christianity that goes on to the Protestant Reformation. So that's Byzantium. But Islam, as I think I mentioned earlier today, really it not only preserved, it also brilliantly developed a number of mathematics, of course, architecture, astrology, poetry. It was the high culture of Islam made the contemporary medieval Europe look like a total barbarian backwater, and in a way that's the current tragedy right now, is how much richness is in that tradition that is kind of being suppressed by its own, in part by its own current authorities, religious authorities, and yet, I mean, the world that Islam, for example, just in terms of multicultural dialogue in the Spanish, Hispanic, Iberian Peninsula, was a model for what we could have, and to some extent what we do have in much of Europe and the United States now. So, yeah, in terms of this, so I think it's pretty characteristic of that. This is by no means a Western sensibility. It's the tribal, the primal, the shamanic, the animistic. That's pretty ubiquitous. this too, as I tried to emphasize, really from the Hindu, Buddhist, Judaic, Greek, Persian, I mean, all these, right up to Christianity and Islam, this axial revolution takes totally different forms in each case, but it all has this quality of a disclosure of a transcendent reality, which in Islam takes a very potent form of, submission to the divine power. And by the way, I'd say, there's certain forms of Islam, of course, that are just exquisitely, the Sufi stream that we see in a figure like Rumi is just, carries a certain form of spirituality that is hardly approached in any, that's one of the places where one can value the total multiplicity of religious traditions and how each one is carrying certain treasures that are not carried by others. And so this second circle, as it were, in the mandala is also trans-European. It's the modern that becomes highly Eurocentric. And in fact, this is a Eurocentric sense. This is the Cartesian ego. It's Eurocentric. It's a certain form of rationality is characteristic of it. But the thing is that it's this particular sensibility that has gone on to shape the entire world. There's no part of the world that isn't being affected by it. Not in a, well, if you talk to people from India, you have people who are very much in this and in different forms of this, either animistic or highly transcendental kind of dualism or non-dual forms of a axial revelation. But the modern is just sweeping through. But people will hold they'll have, like, astrology is taught in the universities there in India, or you've got, in the same block you'll have the highly modern technology and businesses combined with Hindu ritual and beliefs, and so it's very, very complicated. And same thing in China, where you also have this overlay of communist atheism, of Marxism, that is straight out of this worldview, but then gets imported. So and then you've got right in the United States, for example, you've got Native American indigenous peoples who excuse me, have hardly bought into this. And the sense of the loss of the sacred place that defined their religion, their people, their rituals, their sense of relationship to the sacred is enough to drive one to drink, which literally has taken place. So this is particularly on the one hand, is a drawing that is attempting to pull out or illustrate certain complex aspects of a narrative that has been particularly embodied in the European and then Western trajectory, but it has parallels in other cultures throughout the world. And now, in some ways, and this is one of the points of Sean Kelly's Coming Home, the birth and transformation of the planetary era, is how much, in the course of the modern era, the planet became unified, and every culture is now in interaction with every other one. And as a result, we're all being affected by what happened in 17th century France and or 16th century, 15th century Italy, and so forth. We're all, and in ancient Greece and in Christianity, etc. So, and this down here, I mean, well, this is still to come. I don't want it, but the whole 20th century, when we were truly a globally interconnected world, has been so carried into 20th and early 21st century, carried into this this vaster cosmos, this indeterminacy of reality, this multiplicity of perspectives, the global multicultural reality that is not only part of our world, it's part of our inner worlds. Each of us as identities are carrying around multiple cultures and perspectives and identities. And so this is not, when we get down to this area here, I'll try to unpack the multiple dimensions and complexity of and fluidity of what's happening here, which is in some sense pulling in all the other circles. So anyway, does that help in terms of situating this necessarily Western project that we're studying in this particular course in a larger view of world history? Thanks. And then Max.
It's been interesting reading this this narrative of progress unfold with the kind of developmental model of spiral dynamics in mind, because I'm watching how, collectively it more or less seems to fit that in stages of the worldview, and at the same time it seems like the progression has been so contingent upon the nuances and the particulars of the figures involved that it really, it seems based in the details that models like that can't really capture. It's so personal to each individual. So I was wondering what your opinion is on the validity of any kind of model like that in the first place, and then the way that the relationship between the particulars and the kind of archetypal outlines.
Well, I'll just say this, because I'm not an expert on spiral dynamics, but obviously a lot of spiral dynamics is happening here. What I would say is one of the, some of the theoretical exercises in giving a kind of theory of everything that set in motion, that place all these different eras and so forth in a hierarchy, often seemed to me, and this was a criticism I felt 25 years ago, they tended to lack a kind of flesh and blood drama, and that's why I was so drawn towards a different way of I didn't approach this with a pre-given structure. Like this came way later, and the whole, as you'll see, the whole drama between the masculine and feminine came way later. So it was the study of and the immersion in these different figures that brought the meaning to life for me in a way that I don't think could happen if I started with an a priori theory. My wife Heather, during all the years that I was writing this, would tell me and others who would come to dinner and so in later years, she'd say, I didn't know who I was going to be eating dinner with that night, whether it was like Thomas Aquinas was there or Galileo was there or Luther or whatever, because I was so into that she felt that I was kind of embodying those particular figures. And I remember that what I would do with each section is I would so immerse myself in that era and in that person's thought and read their language till this is my Moon Neptune side of me. It's like I would see through their eyes. I mean, I actually sort of felt that. Like I just felt like that Nietzsche was living in me or something like that. So not to make too big a thing of it, but I feel that's why I emphasized in the beginning how important it is, I felt, to have a kind of sympathetic imagination to enter into the worldviews of other times and other people in order because a coldly objectifying view is just not going to understand it. So thanks. I'd love to hear more about that sometime, about the cross relevance of those. And Max, you had your hand up.
It seemed, when I was reading this section on Aquinas, it seemed like he had a very non-dualistic perspective, like a tantric saint or something, and I just wanted to get more information about that.
He was definitely, as Father Bruno Barnhart, who was the abbot, the head of the monastery in Big Sur, the Benedictine Camaldolese monastery, during the years that I was director of programs at Esalen. So these are these two sort of like Dionysian pagan monastery and then the Christian Catholic monastic ascetic monastery up the road about 20 minutes. And he was one of the closest readers of Passion, and we had many, many conversations. And I remember one thing he said about Aquinas. He said Aquinas was like standing in the full light of the sun. It was just like coming right through him, the solar logos. And Aquinas is, even though he writes like the Summa, the Theologica Summa that he wrote, has a quality of just the most precise analysis, and at first you might think, oh, this is going to be just really dry, etc., and dry and abstract. But there's a beauty to Aquinas that, I mean, he seems to have been, I mean, he was so brilliant. He was a really big man, and he had several secretaries at once that he would just be dictating. He was kind of viewed as a treasure by the universities and the church, and he was just it was just coming through him with great tantric force in some sense, even though he had all sorts of limitations, which we can see now. But for his time, he was phenomenal. And one of the things I love especially about Aquinas is that when you read his description of an archetype, when you read any argument that when he's looking at a particular argument within scholastic discourse, what he does is he gives the very best articulation to each view, even the one he will ultimately disagree with, contrary to the way many more one-sidedly tendentious scholars will write, or philosophers will write, where they'll kind of set up a straw man. They won't do justice to the other person's argument. They'll do it in a caricatured way in order to uplift the validity of their own. And so that when you read it, you just go, of course that other person is just, so stupid. How did anybody take that seriously for one moment? I mean, if like Republican, Democrat debates are like that, just totally caricaturing typically the other. I mean, what really works is when you don't caricature and they nail them with their own language. But that is the tendency in soundbite debates today and that type of thing. But it's also a tendency even in like transpersonal literature to distort, caricature the opposing view. And what Aquinas did with almost a kind of divine fairness and equanimity is he gave the very, very best, most intelligent formulation of each position. And and weighed them all, and then came in with the position that he felt was the most compelling, the correct answer, as it were. And that came as a result of, he's climaxing a whole several centuries of profound scholastic education, where they were looking at yes or no. Here's this perspective, here's that perspective. This is what this authority said, this is what that authority said. How can we, who's right? And he just did it with such brilliance. But he also, I think, very much does have, he's a tremendous movement, represents a tremendous movement towards a reunification of heaven and earth, in a sense, again, in a new way that affirms human autonomy, intellectual development, the divine benevolence. He puts it all together in a way that elevates nature from its supernatural shadow that it had been in the earlier Middle Ages, and makes possible with a theological justification what is about to emerge in the modern mind. Okay, it's 6 o'clock. Thanks a lot for paying such close attention, and I'll see you in 3 weeks from now, this room, and you know your reading assignment, right?